Hello and welcome to the Corporate Research Forum webinar, Transforming the Learning Function. I'm delighted to have you with us. In the studio here with me today, I've got Tracy Waters from Sky and Peter Shepherd from Ericsson, Gillian from Corporate Research, Corporate Research Forum, and Mark Williamson from KPMG. So welcome all of you here. Now, those of you who've participated in these webinars before know that we like to make them interactive. So you will see that there is a chat facility where you can send us questions. I've got a series of questions I'm interested in asking the panel today, but obviously I'll ask yours if you can send them through to us. And we also like to engage you in terms of understanding your views on particular topics. So as you know, we've just concluded some research on this topic, and we'll be sharing some of those research findings as we go through the webinar on your screens. But what we'll also be doing is getting your point of view and understanding if your perspective also correlates with what we found in the research. So before I dive into having a conversation here in the studio, I'll just flag the first poll for you. So while you're listening to our conversation, if you can answer the question, where does building capacity for innovation and future business growth sit on the priority list for your learning function? So have a think about that while we're talking. So as you know, most of the work that we do here at the Corporate Research Forum is looking at organisational effectiveness, and in particular looking at how the HR function can improve business performance and organisational performance. And one of the critical elements that has flown through all of our recent research is the link to the business strategy. Now that may seem a fairly obvious thing to say, that what we're doing in the HR function needs to deliver value from a business point of view, but sadly our research has often shown that isn't the case. So I'd like us to start that conversation, the conversation we're going to have today there, which is the link between business priorities and how you ensure that the learning that's being delivered is linked to what the business really needs. Peter, could I start with you on that one? Ericsson, you're in a fast-changing environment. How are you ensuring that what you're delivering is meeting the business needs?
Yeah, so in Ericsson, we distinguish between self-directed learning and business-driven learning. And what we focus the L&D team on is the business-driven learning element. And that really starts with skilling up or making as skilled as possible the learning team. So we put a lot of effort over the last few years into improving the consultancy skills in our learning consultants and professionals. But what we do with that is that we then work with the business, work with the leaders across the business to build business-driven learning plans. Okay. So with that, what we do is we hold workshops, we hold interviews, meetings with the business to build those plans. And of course, when we build those plans, we start with what the key performance gaps are in the business.
So is that part of the regular business? So you've got a regular business planning cycle, which will be tied into the budget planning cycle. You're slotting into that, are you, or it's a separate activity?
Yes. Okay. So it's part of the strategy planning and business planning cycle within Ericsson.
So as a line manager, I'm used to doing that. That's a rhythm in the year that I'm already used to, and then you're coming along and having a conversation with me about, so that's what I'm trying to achieve from a business point of view. What's the gap that I'm needing to?
Yes, you're absolutely right. But the honest reply is that we have to fight for time and agendas, of course. It's not as simple as just slotting in.
Yeah.
We have to kind of win that time from the leaders.
So
and we have to show that we can implement those plans as well, and that we follow through.
Okay.
And that, I think, is really important because what we show and then report back and work with the business to say, we built this plan with you, this is what we've actually delivered as well.
Right, okay, all right, that's helpful, thank you. Now I know, Tracy, your particular sector is being significantly disrupted. Massively. And change practically on a daily basis. So I'm imagining that must be quite hard because you might agree some business priorities, but actually then they shift. So what have you been doing within Sky to try and ensure that the work you and your team are doing are aligned to those shifts?
Well, it's really true to say that the goalposts are ever changing, and so actually to even have a plan is one thing, but you just know that that plan is going to change. So we had to fundamentally look at the way that the L&D team was operating, and the traditional, and I'll generalise massively, but the traditional approach for L&D is to define the need, design the solution, and then deliver it, which is kind of quite sequential and linear. And actually that was not keeping up with the pace of our business, and we had 4 very specific problems that we had to solve within our team before we could be relevant to the business. One was pace. Our responsiveness has to be measured in days and weeks, not months and years. Secondly, we have to have minimal waste. So, and by that I mean maximum value for lowest cost. Thirdly, we had to look at data. We had to look at data in a completely different way, move away from preferences and opinions, and even best practice, because best practice is often out of date by the time it gets to that live moment. And the fourth problem was what I would call silos, that L&D is traditionally compartmentalised and structured with kind of their own deliverables within that function, like leadership, management, business skills. And actually the problem there is you have single points of failure and you have the silo mentality instead of actually having the learning function moving quite flexibly. So we actually looked beyond our function into Agile, which is with a capital A, so it's actually a technology or software development methodology, and we've adopted that for now nearly a year.
Okay. And by adopting that Agile approach, that's enabling you to keep pace with the business. So you mentioned pace was the first thing. How particularly has that improved things for you? For those on the webinar who might not know the Agile process, what are the characteristics of it that have meant that it's been of value to you?
The main thing with Agile is that you don't try and build a car from nothing. So you're not trying to deliver a complete shiny solution which the business has to wait for before it can get to. And by the way, it may not have even wanted a car. It just wanted to get from A to B, which means a skateboard would have been just fine. So we have to move away from what we think solutions look like and actually therefore come up with almost like what is the minimum that we can deliver to the business as quickly as possible that will keep it moving.
So prototyping.
Prototyping, experimenting. So not defining, designing and delivering, but actually exploring, collaborating and experimenting. And data then becomes very important because you're getting feedback in real time whether you've nailed it or not. So my team now thinks in longer term, where are we going and what's our priority list, but we can deliver in 2 weeks robust solutions.
Okay, that's really helpful.
And of course they're sprints, aren't they?
Sprints,
and
they're time boxed.
Time boxed sprints are the way
we
do
now
that.
speak a whole different language.
Sprints and pace work well.
Yes.
So Mark, are you seeing that sort of thing in other organisations that you're working with, or other ways that businesses are managing to lock into the business agenda?
Yeah, I absolutely agree on the Agile approach there. I think we're seeing across the board that real demand for pace, relevance, and immediacy in terms of delivery around that. So those things are key. Lots of that driven by actually disruption across industries. So it's a bit hackneyed, but the whole digital transformation, digital business model is changing everything at a pace that we've never seen before. And from a learning point of view, being able to build those skills and capabilities quickly enough to handle that, or actually to drive that and to execute strategy against that, I think is key. And then I think the other thing that we see a lot of really is really improve it, well, how L&D or how the learning function overall can improve its alignment. Because as we're saying, there's some criticism around how well aligned we are from a strategy point of view. And I think with what Peter was saying around the really embedding the derivation of learning needs with the business and driving that is absolutely key. So there's something around the sort of strategy and process around that. I think there's something around the business acumen that learning brings to the business overall. So you get that credibility in the conversation. And then I think there's a kind of a top-down and bottom-up thing around how you're driving your workforce plans and what that means from a skills and capability point of view, and how you're bringing up your learning needs through working across the business. For me, those are the things that are going on.
And Gillian, I know in the research, picking up on what Mark's just saying there about how an organisation connects its various bits. So governance is often a bit of a dirty word, but how the learning process is governed linked to strategy. You know, what did we find from the research in that?
I do think governance has a very important role to play, and I guess the word itself might have connotations around bureaucracy, but that's not at all where we were coming at this from. But in the research, we asked, we conducted a survey, and one of the questions we asked was, do you have some form of governance structure, such as a learning council or other mechanism for getting input from the business and sort of directing the activities of the learning function from a strategic point of view. And I mean, what we found, only 26% of respondents actually have some such mechanism. Okay. So that was really quite surprising. You know, that was really quite a low number. And that was backed up by the interviews that we did. And again, we asked the same question, but in a sort of qualitative interview setting. And we found that for many of those organisations who do have some sort of governance mechanism, when we drilled down deeper to ask, you know, who's on that learning council, or, you know, who gets involved in these discussions, in many cases it only involved the HR function. So we didn't have business people actually involved in those conversations. So that then leads to the question, well, you know, even if you have these mechanisms
talking to yourself,
in place,
essentially.
you're in an echo chamber, and you're not actually getting input from the people who matter, who are essentially the customers and the end users for the learning function. So that for me was a real challenge. You know, how do we build a mechanism that isn't overly bureaucratic and, you know, to your point, Peter, fits in with the business cycle without putting too much in the way of onerous demands on the business. But we make sure that we get that input, we have that oversight, and that sort of check that we are focused on the right activities.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're mentioning the business cycle, Peter. Yesterday we had a peer practitioner group on the same topic, and someone in their organisation was saying they have quarterly project reviews or quarterly reviews, and that's where they've enabled the governance to come in. So it's a much more live conversation, which is saying, well, we're trying to move, you know, significant pieces of work from A to B. In order to do that, where are we struggling, and therefore what's the capability gap?
And I do think that's important, that whatever governance you put in, that it is dynamic and moves quickly with the business. And what we tend to do is we ask our learning consultants and our heads of learning to go back and talk to their key stakeholders, quarterly basis, to go through how those business plans are going, and really to make sure that they're checking in to say, what is changing about the business now? You know, the plans that we put in place, are they still relevant, or are they, do we need to update them? So that kind of dynamic element, I think, is really important.
Okay. Well, I just want to pick up, because we've got the poll results in now, because it links to sort of the next theme, which we're talking about. So we know there's a significant amount of change. We know there's disruption, and therefore we might assume that innovation would be a core capability that a lot of organisations are actually looking to drive. And yet only 11% of our respondents said that in the research that we did, said that it was critical. So that's why we've asked the question of the audience here. So what's interesting is we've asked the question, where does building capacity for innovation and future business growth sit on your priority list for the learning function? So 47% of you who are on the webinar today are saying it's one of your top 3 priorities. So that's better than the initial research. Only 18% have said it's number 1 priority, and I'm guessing in businesses where the pace of change isn't quite so fast. But 29% are saying it's not falling in the top 3. So it's important, but we've got other things coming first. So I'm just curious about, you know, that whole area of innovation, because what you're sort of saying is that, you know, what we're seeing in the research is that 90% of people are saying it's really important, but when we talk to business leaders, there's only 20% of them said they were happy with what their learning functions were actually doing in this regard. So I'm interested in terms of what your thoughts are on that, in terms of trying to be innovative, trying to be more creative, what your experience is on that. Peter,
I mean, one of the reasons for that may be that in Ericsson, you know, we have done we have done innovation training, de Bono 6 hats and so on. We found that that had quite a limited effect on how innovative we are as a company. We've done numerous types of innovation schemes and suggestion type schemes. They, I think, have limited effect. Where I think as a learning function we do have a strong effect is in helping to create a culture of innovation.
Okay.
And it's affecting that culture that really matters. And how are we doing that? Well, one of the things that we've focused on at the moment is integrating collaboration, knowledge management with learning, because that makes us more effective as a company and actually as a learning function. And if I give you kind of one example that we're doing, one important project for us at the moment is that we are changing our SharePoint site. Typically you distribute, you give access to learning through SharePoint sites. We are changing that from being purely learning focused to being a combination of knowledge assets and also collaboration. So when you do your search on that site, what will come up now is who are the relevant people to talk to.
And they won't necessarily be in the learning function. So that's what you're saying. There'll be knowledge management folks.
Absolutely
they'll be right.
not.
Okay.
No, they will be. If a key subject for us, for example, at the moment is 5G, 5th generation networks. If you put that into the search function, it will come up who are the experts in 5G. It would come up what are the key knowledge assets in terms of templates and so on, and what's the learning related to it. So that's kind of one example of where we're trying to affect the culture.
Can I pick up on that? Just as a follow-up question come in from Rui Mendes da Costa, who's head of learning and training from Galp. And his question is around the Learning Council, but I think it applies to the answer you've just given me, and which is about the tendency for us to focus internally and to believe that expertise is only internal. And his question is around, should it not also be external, so that we're keeping pace with what's going on in the external environment? So I'm just wondering, I'll go to you just in terms of the SharePoint, and then I'll ask others in terms of, does that also allow people to access external insight as well as internal insight?
Yeah, it doesn't really allow external inputs. It only does it in a fairly limited way.
Yeah.
But this is kind of step one of what we want to achieve with learning platforms. And a lot of those of you on the webinar today will know about learning experience platforms, and they enable that external connection and input.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that because we're going to have a bit of a conversation a bit later about technologies. So Tracy, for you, I mean, you've already said, that agility and pace is really important, and innovation, I expect, in the same space is a challenge. And so from the team that you've had, what have you learnt in terms of trying to support the business and also for your own team in terms of being innovative?
I think it goes without saying innovation at Sky is a number one. If my CEO answered that question and I didn't put that in the top three,
You'd be
I
in
think
trouble.
I would be getting my P45. I think I'll answer it slightly differently, which is where one of the reasons for making what was actually quite a fundamental choice to shift to Agile was that the driving mindset behind it is around collaboration, it's around customer, and obviously in our world that's internal customers, it's around data, and it's around iteration. And all of those things, if you take those concepts, also relate to innovation. And if as a learning team, as a learning function, you are not innovating yourself, if you are not looking outwards and bringing it in, if you are not experimenting regularly, if you are not iterating yourself, how can you possibly support the business to do the same? So there's something about, as a learning function, being willing to look at how we do things and whether in fact it is aligned to what the business needs us to do. And if it's not, there is no way we could ever achieve that objective of helping the company
you wouldn't have any
innovate.
credibility with them. And so I think what I'm hearing both of you say is that it's been more important to understand the context within which innovation occurs and helping the organisation create a climate that allows for that. So collaboration, from your point of view, pace and change, in another. Gillian, from the research that we had, what were some other organisations paying attention to in this space, and where were some of the challenges?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one message that came across loud and clear throughout the research was this idea of operating at the organisational level. So real change happens here when you look, we've talked about context and culture. What we did do as part of the research was revisit the idea of the learning organisation. So we obviously that was something that was very hot, 20, 30 years ago with Peter Senge's work and others. But so we felt at the outset, we felt that the learning organisation might be a good start point in terms of addressing the challenges of innovation and renewal and transformation and dealing in a sort of fast-paced digital world. And that, I think that did bear out in practice, but it was interesting. Some of the examples of learning organisations are examples that have been around for decades. So, we talked to W.L. Gore, who have a strong track record here, and they were set up to operate along those lines in the 60s and have been doing it ever since.
Yeah.
So this is not necessarily a new idea.
Well, and it's interesting, we've just come through, and this is the learning manager in Shell, Myrta, who is saying exactly that point, that the satisfaction of business leaders with their learning function very much depends on the maturity of the learning organisation.
Yes,
so,
most definitely,
and coming from Shell, which is an organisation that's also invested in that, I can understand why they might make that point of view.
And that was another organisation we interviewed for the research was Shell. So it's not necessarily those organisations who are in the digital space as well who are doing this. But what it does require is a commitment to invest in building the organisation, and it takes time. You can't suddenly switch from being something else to being a learning organisation.
And can you say something about, because we ended up looking at sort of different categories of learning, and that certainly prompted a lot of discussion in the events that we ran last week.
That's
can you say a bit more about
that?
Because
I think the other point I would like to make around this is it's important to be, as a learning function, to be mindful about where you're focusing your effort and your activity. And so we through the course of the research, we singled out some different types of learning, and we ended up putting it in a 2x2 matrix in sort of good consulting style. So we differentiated what we called productive learning, which is essentially focused on getting better at what you already have to do. So it's really important in terms of building productivity and performance within the core business, but it's not necessarily going to get you to where you need to be next week, tomorrow, down the line. So we contrasted productive with what we call generative learning, and that's really the type of learning that gets you from where you are today to developing new strategies, to being able to sense what's going on in the outside world and bring that inside and really understand the implications of that for the organisation. So, and I think what we found in sharing this model with people through the research is that it can be quite a helpful way of sort of running thought experiments in terms of analysing where are we focusing our energy as a learning function. We overlaid on top of that, so as well as looking at productive and generative in terms of the types of learning you focus on, we also looked at whether where you have greatest impact, is that helping individuals get better, or is that focusing at the organisational level? And clearly, if you're going to continue improving your performance as a business, you have to help individuals get better at what they do. But where we see greatest impact is where you have the focus on the organisation and the context and the culture, overlaying with looking to the future and this idea of generative learning. So how that might look in practical terms, we came across examples of organisations who, for example, get teams of people together to co-create new strategies or to solve specific business problems that they're having real difficulties addressing, or thinking about how we might open up new markets. So that's the sort of thing that, if you're talking about the crossover between organisational and generative learning, it's bringing this idea of collaboration and co-creation into thinking about where we need to go in the future.
And what was quite striking, we ran 2 events last week and the peer practitioner group yesterday, was the difference between large corporates and smaller startup organisations. So particularly when we were in Berlin last week, we had a participant who was clearly in the startup innovation. His leaders lived and breathed that, and to him, that's where they spent all of their time. And he was having trouble getting them to pay attention to how do I train line managers to have performance conversations. But to him, that was his normal world. And so he wasn't even going to share his experience because to him, well, that's what everybody does, doesn't it? And of course, everybody else in the room was struggling with, well, no, we've got this big curriculum and we've got a corporate university and we're running people through things. So I think there's a debate around what's appropriate depending on the type of business. And Mark, I mean, I know that you're working with a number of organisations in terms of how you balance resources across those areas. Any observations from you in terms of where you're seeing some of the trends?
Yeah, I pick up on the point Peter made earlier on around that collaboration, knowledge and learning kind of, I would say, a virtuous triangle maybe around that. So we see that quite a lot in organisations now, irrespective of their size. And the whole point in how people use technology platforms to facilitate that, I think, is important in it, because again, that can apply at any size of organisation. And I then see quite a healthy tension that you get around that. One is around the sort of self-directed learning focus, again, that we talked about earlier on, and maybe in the case of the colleague in Germany, of how that's generated and how that comes through, with maybe the role of the learning function starting to move into that kind of content curation in that world. And I know that's part of what came out in the research there as well. So I see there's a lot that technology can do and does do to help around that. A big drive around self-directed learning, irrespective of size of organisation and how that works. And then that kind of content curation piece for me is maybe a way to sort of glue those things together.
Okay. So one of the things, and we'll discuss this a bit more, is that we were picking up anecdotally before we started the research was a shift away from classroom-based learning or traditional learning, and everybody talking about digital learning and online learning, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to do a bit of a check-in with the audience in terms of the poll. So we'd like to understand, because what we're noticing is there's a big hype around the technology and less focus on the extent to which that technology really delivers sustainable business performance or behaviour change. And so the question we're curious about is in terms of the new learning technologies versus classroom-based learning. From your experience, those of you who are listening in, which is better at delivering sustained behaviour change? What's your experience on that? So just let you think about that and respond to that. But I know each of you have been experimenting with different types of technology. So just interested to understand how you're using that and where it's working and where you see it fitting in. So I think you mentioned earlier sort of that the systems that are going to allow you to bring in the external perspective as well in terms of online. Can you say a bit more about that, Peter?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's a change in terms of what people expect from learning. And people expect learning kind of just at the right point. They're not going to wait around for kind of 4 or 5 months for some bit of classroom training to come along.
For the learning function to crack on and deliver something.
Yeah, exactly.
Design and then deliver.
And go through a very slow ADDIE cycle to come back to the Agile point. So new learning platforms, I think, are helping employees, leaders around the world kind of access the learning that's right for them at the right point. And there are new companies, there are existing companies that are moving us on from, if you like, the LMS world, and moving us to what we are now call learning experience platforms, which can access external learning as and when you need it very quickly, whether it be TED Talks, YouTube, whatever. They can access your content libraries and your internal content and find the right learning for you. And that's the important point, that it becomes personalised to you. And it's amazing, isn't it, that you sit at home, you buy what you need from Amazon, and you have that kind of consumer experience, and that consumer grade experience. You come into work and you get a lower level experience. And what we've got to do in L&D is kind of bring ourselves up to that consumer grade. And that means providing learning just when people need it, using the kind of AI and algorithms that make it possible.
So do you see a future whereby, say, I'm a learner and I've gone and accessed certain kinds, so when I go shopping on Amazon, it pops up and says, people who bought a book like this also read all of these. So are you imagining a future where if I've gone and consumed, I don't know, how to have a difficult conversation, that it will then learn my preferences and give me some suggestions?
I mean, the point is, Karen, that it's not imagining. It's
now.
It's here now.
And
So
are you
here's
already using it?
So we're kind of, we are about to pilot. We're testing different systems at the moment, so it is available now. And undoubtedly, most learning systems will move in this direction because that's what people expect and people should get.
So coming back, so can I ask then your views on a word which Mark used earlier, which is the role of the learning function in terms of curation? Because in the same way as we've got fake news, I can imagine that there'll be a wealth of stuff that gets put out there as learning, which frankly isn't worth the video camera that it's taken with or the PowerPoint that it's put together. So how would you see, ensuring that the quality that's coming through on those self-directed platforms is actually fit for purpose for the business?
Well, I think there's a couple of points there. I think number one, I think, is that the traditional curation has to be really spot on, and curation becomes a really important skill for us in learning. And I think secondly, the kind of challenge is down to these companies that their AI and algorithms has to be really, really strong.
Okay.
And I would add to that you've got to move away from learning thinking it's the only people in the world who can do learning, because actually people are doing it themselves every day. They're asking people next to them and they're searching on Google. And you need to add something that's more valuable than what they can get from those two sources. And that's a massive shift. And actually, I think what I would just add to that curation point is it's the kind of the crowdsourcing of what is good. You kind of have to let ratings or real-time feedback drive what goes up to the top of the pile and goes to the bottom of the pile. So you have got thousands of people deciding what's relevant and valuable, not a team of X number of people in head office.
So I'm curious about that. So I understand how that could be business relevant. So we all need this, but how do we then ensure that the learning is underpinned by some valid science? Because there's a lot of nonsense out there. And so I'm just curious about, just because somebody likes a video or likes a piece of content doesn't mean to say, A, it's going to teach them anything, they're going to learn anything from it, or it's going to be of value to the business. So I'm just curious about how that might work.
Well, I think, because my ideal scenario is that we don't need a separate platform for learning.
Okay.
So the idea of turn left for learning, which means you're deviating from your day-to-day work, and it's something that you have to kind of separate, and if you haven't separated it, therefore you haven't learnt anything. And I haven't cracked this right, but there's something where if people have to log on to a platform to get learning, I think we've actually created a problem for the business.
Well, there's a barrier there.
And I think, and L&D generally, this is, if I wound the clock back merely a year, would be describing myself and my team. We're just a constraint provider. There is a schedule, there is a cohort, there is a program, there are limits of time, people, resource, and people just go, I can't work with your constraints. And if we keep separating learning and having separate platforms, then we're also adding another constraint that they have to now remember where that is, and they're limited by what's on it, and they're limited by what the business says is relevant to them, and they limit, and they're like,
too hard. It's gone in the too hard box.
Too hard. Learning is not relevant to me. Okay. Learning with a capital L.
Yes.
I'm still doing the verb with the lowercase learning all the time. I don't need you anymore.
Yeah, okay. Gillian?
Yeah, and I think back to your point about science, you know, we need to keep focused on how people learn. And, you know, we know where neuroscience, for example, is giving us more and more insight into how the brain works and the role of the brain in learning. But also going back to some basic principles, we know that the best learning has to be relevant to the job that an individual is doing. So the closer we can bring that to their day-to-day role, the more effective that's going to be. And there has to be some sort of internal driver for the individual to learn as well. So there's got to be some incentive. It's going to help them do their job more effectively, get more satisfaction from their work, whatever that might be. So
or it addresses a concern, because when people are concerned,
absolutely,
and they have a need.
Yes,
so if there's a pain point.
There's a pain point.
Yes,
that's when they go looking.
That's right, and that's where we've seen there are examples of, and I think you're alluding, Peter, in some of the things you're saying, but this idea of performance support systems as well, where you would investigate the key problems and issues that people encounter on a regular basis, and perhaps crowdsourcing solutions and ideas. Specifically around business problems. I know this is something that, for example, the energy companies have invested quite significantly in. So you can be an engineer working on, for example, an oil pipeline, and there's a system that will help you identify for that particular issue that you're working on at that time, will give you some insights into how to address that problem. So you know, I think we'll see more and more of that sort of technology.
I think you make a really important point, Julian, about the fact that kind of performance enablement type processes have to be working effectively for individuals to identify the correct and the best learning for them.
Yeah.
And that means the kind of shifts that we're seeing towards more and improved leader and employee conversations as part of your performance enablement or performance management processes is important, and that development becomes centre stage on that.
Yeah, and it picks up a point that's come through. Dave Milner from IBM has also mentioned then the issue of impact evaluation and analytics, and in a sense analytics is kind of even further behind than some of the things that we're talking about, that unless we're clear about what's the shift in performance, what's the pain point and what's the shift in performance, and we're making any attempt to measure that, that we're not going to be impactful. So I'll go to you in a second, Mark. I just want to flag, so we've got the results of the polling, and to just comment on that, which is quite interesting. So we asked which is better at delivering sustained behaviour change, new learning technologies or classroom-based learning. And only 7% have said that they think the virtual technologies are better. 44% are saying classroom-based learning, and 48% are hedging their bets and saying it's both the same. And I'm just wondering, from your experience, Mark, what you're seeing, you know, with some of your clients in terms of the use of technology in more performance shifts like we're talking about.
So my view on this and what I see is the blend is still very, very true. So I see blended learning as something that organisations pretty much across the board use. They use it in different ways. Where I see it as being most effective is using instructor-led or face-to-face in a very experiential way. And doing things around scenarios and working together in teams, collaboration, all of those things. It seems to me to be something that works well. And then utilising digital for all of the things from a skills perspective and a knowledge perspective around that. But having said that, you can make digital really immersive. And use of branching, use of technology in a way that really draws you in emotionally, just as much as rationally, I think is really important around that, and plays to adult learning themes and approaches around that overall. So I think for me that's one element.
Just in case anyone we've just studied that there are cannons being fired across the river from where we're sitting here, which is why we're all suddenly wondering what the rather loud bangs are. So
I managed to ignore that quite well, didn't I?
Well, except for continuing, so we're fine.
Keep calm and carry on.
Yes,
and all that.
Exactly.
I think the other thing where we're being more innovative around how we're utilising technology to address some of these things is short format.
Yes.
So micro-learning and all of those things,
Targeted.
again, targeted works really well. People can consume that really quickly and easily. Combine that with the platforms that you deliver that on, mobile, tablet, whatever. So making it something that people can really access and consume easily. Those things, I think, will help around that overall. Then you can combine it with social, learner-generated, external and internal, as we've talked about. You've got a rich set of content there overall, and then finally, as you get into the the augmented and virtual world around that, that offers another level. But we're at the early stages, I would say, on that.
We're in the last 5 minutes, so I'm going to shift the conversation slightly. Tony has asked from O2, Tony Mercado, around the consequences of this for the learning function. And how do you take your existing learning function? Do we need to get rid of them all and start again, or can we evolve our current focus? So we'll make that the last topic. And I know, Tracy, you've got a view on this because you've, in a sense, had your team and you've had to transform the way they've worked without getting rid of them. So can you say something about the implications and any practical tips? So if any of you've got any tips for your teams as well, that would be great.
I think it's important to mention that the kind of the transformation, and I think it is genuinely, I can use that word quite authentically over the past year, has involved no change of person in my team. But has their capability around data, their capability about digital, multimedia, understanding analytics, the understanding the need of the customer and how they get to that quickly and run experiments and become scientists. They have developed that through the change of context, which is where we are no longer doing learning like we used to, and we are going to do it fundamentally differently. And of course that
starts with them.
Necessity is the mother of invention. And they have, could I have trained the team, tried to train the team to be more collaborative, more empowered, more digital savvy? I could have tried, but it all happened because of the change to the context and the way of working and the mindset. So you can transform with existing people. I think the thing I would say I'm very fortunate about is I had a really, highly skilled, highly willed team. So lucky me.
Okay, well done. Thank you. Peter, your perspective on this?
I think Tracy's kind of bang on in terms of what matters. I think is that we look at experimentation. So I think L&D teams have to be open to experimentation themselves,
yeah.
and also doing different things. So whether it be experimenting in simulation, 3D, and different types of learning, and also the platforms piece. But I think also that learning teams have to be open to becoming more business orientated. And transforming in that way. We've been transforming for about 5 years. Yes, we brought in a few additional skills, but fundamentally it's the same people.
Gillian, any additional skills that popped up in the research?
Well, I think back to this idea of working on the organisation, I think one of the things that we found is the more effective learning organisations tend to have a strong at the very least a collaboration between organisation and development and learning and development, if not the same skills in people who are involved in learning and development. So I think working on, and Peter earlier you talked about consultancy skills, I think that's going to be increasingly important to have very strong business acumen and ability to have those good conversations with the business, coupled with a good understanding of things like systems thinking and organisation development capability.
So some of the underlying social sciences.
Absolutely,
yeah. And for you, Mark, last comment?
I very much pick up on the business acumen one for me, and I think that is a virtuous circle around that. So the more that learning professionals are really fluent in the priorities of the business and what's going on, and have that continuous conversation with the business around that to hit all of the agile areas that Tracy was talking about there, and hit that kind of continuous strategic evolution that Peter was talking about. I think those are the key things for me, because business acumen, you get the respect from the business, and you start to build the right content, right learning for the business through that.
Thank you. Well, and thank you to all the contributions. We've had some good questions in which we haven't had time to respond. So we will, if you've put a question in that we haven't responded to here in the studio, we will come online and give you a response when we're closed. So it just remains for me to say thank you to everyone here in the studio. Thank you whoever it is that's firing a cannon outside across the water from us. And,
21 gun salute for CRF.
yeah, 21 gun salute going on for us. And thank you for your attention.